Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. Every year, millions of people walk through Vatican City. They stand beneath the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, necks craned, eyes tracing Michelangelo's outstretched finger of God. They step into St. Peter's Basilica, overwhelmed by the enormity of marble columns and golden light filtering through stained glass. They photograph the Swiss guards in their Renaissance uniforms, standing motionless like painted sentries from another century. The tourists believe they've seen the Vatican. They believe they've witnessed the heart of one of the world's most powerful institutions. But there's a door they'll never see. It exists deep within the Apostolic Palace, unmarked and unadorned. No velvet ropes guide visitors toward it. No plaques explain its significance. The hallway leading to this door is silent in a way that feels deliberate, as if sound itself has been instructed to stay away. The walls are thick, built centuries ago when secrecy required stone and mortar rather than passwords and encryption. This door is not guarded by soldiers. It doesn't need to be. It's guarded by something far more effective: invisibility. Beyond this door lies the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known by a more honest name, the Vatican Secret Archives. The rebranding happened recently, an attempt to soften perception, but the old name lingers because it was always more accurate. This is not a library in any conventional sense. It's not a place where knowledge is shared. It's a place where knowledge is kept. The numbers alone are staggering. 53 miles of shelving stretch through climate-controlled rooms. 35,000 volumes of catalogue attempt to organize 12 centuries of documentation. Papal bulls, ancient manuscripts, diplomatic correspondence, trial records and texts in languages most scholars have never encountered. The oldest document dates back to the 8th century, though whispers suggest there are fragments far older, pieces of parchment that predate the official founding of the archives by centuries. But here's what should trouble you. 53 miles of shelving represents only what they acknowledge. These are the documents they've catalogued, sorted, and stored in a system that can be theoretically accessed by approved researchers after months of applications and security clearances. These are the secrets they're willing to admit exist. What about the texts they don't catalogue? What about knowledge so dangerous, so fundamentally destabilizing, that it can't even be listed in an inventory? Every institution has files within files, secrets within secrets. The Vatican has had 2,000 years to perfect the art of concealment. They've stored documents in unmarked boxes. They've digitized files without making them searchable. They've created categories of information that exist outside the official classification system. The door stands there, silent and final. On one side, tourists wander through Renaissance hallways, believing they've glimpsed the soul of the Catholic Church. On the other side, in rooms where humidity and temperature are monitored more carefully than most hospital operating theatres, the real story of humanity waits in the dark. And it's waiting for a reason. The Vatican archives were officially established in 1612 by Pope Paul V, who decided that the Church's accumulated documents needed proper organization. That's the story they tell. But the collection itself is far older. The hoarding of texts began in the 4th century, when the Catholic Church emerged from persecution and transformed into the dominant spiritual authority of the Roman Empire. With power came a new responsibility: controlling narrative. When Rome fell, literacy collapsed across Western Europe. The 1,000-year period we call the Dark Ages wasn't just dark because of violence and instability. It was dark because knowledge nearly died. But the church survived. In monasteries scattered across the continent, monks copied texts by candlelight. They preserved Latin when most of Europe had forgotten how to read. They maintained libraries when cities were burning. But preservation is never neutral. Every time a monk decided which text to copy and which to let fade into obscurity, he made a choice about what future generations would know. The church didn't just preserve knowledge, they curated it. They decided which classical texts aligned with Christian doctrine and which contradicted it. They copied the works that reinforced their authority and allowed competing perspectives to vanish into ash and decay. Plato was acceptable. Certain plays of Euripides were not. Medical texts from Galen could be saved, but the more controversial anatomical studies were left to rot. Then came the Crusades. When European knights invaded the Holy Land, they didn't just fight, they collected. They looted entire libraries from conquered cities. They seized manuscripts from Islamic scholars who had preserved Greek and Roman knowledge that Europe had lost. Texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy flowed back to Rome, where church officials examined them carefully. Some were translated and shared with European universities. Others were locked away, deemed too dangerous for general circulation because they contradicted official church positions on the nature of the cosmos or the human body. By the medieval period, the church had become the world's most efficient intelligence network. Every confession was a data collection point. Every monastery was a listening post. Every bishop reported back to Rome. When heretical sects were crushed, their libraries were confiscated. When mystical orders were disbanded, their writings were seized. The Knights Templar, the Cathars, the Gnostics. Entire movements were erased from history, but their texts weren't destroyed. They were archived, studied, hidden. The Vatican created something called the Archivum Secretum, the secret archive, where documents deemed too sensitive for even limited circulation were stored. Not just religious heresies, but political conspiracies, scientific discoveries that challenged doctrine, prophecies that predicted uncomfortable futures, and correspondence that revealed how much earthly power the church wielded behind its spiritual facade. In 1881, Pope Leo III made a calculated decision. He opened a tiny fraction of the archives to select scholars, carefully chosen academics who could be trusted to handle what they found with appropriate discretion. It was a brilliant move. By allowing limited access, the Vatican created the illusion of transparency while maintaining absolute control. Researchers could request specific documents, but only if they already knew those documents existed. The catalogue itself became a filter. You couldn't ask for what you didn't know to look for. Even today, vast sections remain completely off-limits. Documents sealed by papal decree can't be requested. Entire collections exist in unmarked storage, accessible only to Vatican officials with clearance levels that have never been publicly explained. The Church didn't just become the keeper of secrets, they became the ultimate gatekeeper, deciding what humanity would be allowed to remember and what would remain locked in climate-controlled darkness, waiting for a day that may never come. 53 miles of shelving. Let that number settle for a moment. If you walked the length of every shelf in the Vatican archives, You'd travel farther than the distance from the Vatican to the coast of Italy. But that measurement only accounts for physical shelving. It doesn't include the thousands of documents stored in archival boxes, stacked floor to ceiling in rooms most researchers will never enter. It doesn't count the rolled scrolls kept in cylindrical containers, some so fragile they can't be unrolled without risking disintegration. And it certainly doesn't account for the digitized files, scanned but never made searchable, existing in encrypted databases that only a handful of Vatican officials can access. The Church has released some documents, carefully and strategically. They've shown the world Michelangelo's personal letters, revealing his complaints about payment and his frustration with papal demands. They've published the trial transcripts of Galileo, the astronomer who dared to suggest the Earth revolved around the sun. They've shared the correspondence of Martin Luther, the monk whose criticisms sparked the Protestant Reformation and split Christianity forever. They've opened the files on the Knights Templar trial, showing how a powerful military order was systematically destroyed. They even released Henry VIII's desperate request for annulment, the letter that led England to break from Rome entirely. These are the safe secrets. These are the revelations they're willing to share after 400, 500, 600 years have passed. Time has stripped these documents of their danger. Everyone involved is dead. The political consequences have faded. The secrets have become history, suitable for academic study and documentary films. But if these are the documents they're willing to release after centuries of silence, what are they keeping permanently sealed? What knowledge is so fundamentally dangerous that even the passage of time won't make it safe to reveal? What texts would still destabilize the Church or the world if they were brought into the light? The Vatican has never published a complete catalogue of their holdings. They've never admitted the full scope of what they possess. When researchers request access, they must specify exactly which document they want to see, which means they must already know it exists. The system is designed to protect secrets within secrets, mysteries wrapped in bureaucracy, and sealed with the authority of papal decree. The archives are vast, but the unknowable portions are vaster still. The Bible, sitting in hotel drawers and church pews across the world, feels eternal, as if it materialized fully formed from divine intention. 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. The story of Jesus told in careful harmony, preserved across 2 millennia. But that book, that specific collection of texts, didn't fall from heaven. It was assembled by committees of men in heated rooms, arguing over which writings were sacred and which were dangerous. In 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the Christian world to settle theological disputes that threatened to tear the young religion apart. Christianity wasn't unified then. It was wildly diverse, almost unrecognizably so. There were communities who believed Jesus was fully divine, but never truly human. Others believed he was a great teacher, but not the Son of God. Some thought salvation came through secret knowledge. Others insisted it required strict adherence to Jewish law. Each community had its own texts, its own versions of Jesus' words, its own interpretation of what his life and death meant. The councils that followed, Nicaea, Carthage in 397, and others, made decisions. They voted. They debated the authenticity of certain texts based on apostolic authorship, theological consistency, and political usefulness. Some writings made the cut. Others were rejected and labeled apocryphal, a word that sounds mysterious, but simply means hidden away. The bishops ordered these rejected texts destroyed, burned, buried, erased from the historical record so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even know they existed. Most people assume those orders were carried out completely. They imagine that the alternative gospels, the mystical texts, the writings that portrayed Jesus differently, all vanished into smoke and ash. But that's not what happened. Some monks couldn't bring themselves to destroy sacred writings, even ones condemned as heresy. They hid copies in monastery walls, in sealed jars buried in deserts, in private collections passed down through generations. And the church itself, even as it publicly ordered destruction, quietly confiscated texts and stored them in restricted sections of their growing archives. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging near the town of Nag Hammadi unearthed a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices. Inside were 52 texts, many of them gospels that had been condemned and supposedly destroyed 16 centuries earlier. The discovery shocked scholars. Here was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings that felt alien and mystical. Here was the Gospel of Philip, which hinted at a sacred relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Here were creation myths and theological frameworks that contradicted everything the Catholic Church had taught. But here's what should unsettle you. When scholars began translating these Nag Hammadi texts, they found references in early church writings, condemnations by bishops who had clearly read these Gospels and deemed them heretical. Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father, specifically named and criticized several of these texts, which means the church knew about them, which means copies existed in Christian circles for centuries after they were supposedly destroyed, which means the Vatican, with its obsessive preservation of documents, almost certainly possessed versions of these texts long before a farmer in Egypt stumbled upon buried jars. They never mentioned it. They never said, "Yes, we have these alternative gospels in our archives, but we don't consider them authentic." They remained silent, letting the world believe these texts were lost forever, right up until the moment they were independently rediscovered. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. The Nag Hammadi library contained 52 texts. How many more are sitting in Vatican storage, still unknown to the outside world? How many gospels, written by early Christians who knew Jesus or knew people who knew him, remain locked away because they contradict the official story? How many versions of Christianity were erased not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? The Bible, you know, was decided by a vote. The texts that lost didn't vanish. They were hidden. And some of them are still hidden, waiting in climate-controlled darkness, containing versions of the story that would make the familiar Gospels feel like carefully edited propaganda. There's a name that carries the weight of ultimate betrayal: Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the man who identified his master with a kiss, turning an act of love into an act of treachery. For 2,000 years, his name has been synonymous with betrayal itself. Parents don't name their children Judas. The word has become a curse. But there's another version of this story, a version where Judas isn't the villain, a version where he's the only disciple who truly understood what Jesus needed him to do. The Gospel of Judas was known to exist because early church fathers condemned it. Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, called it heresy and warned Christians against reading it. But no copies survived, or so everyone believed. Then, In the 1970s, a papyrus codex surfaced in Egypt, passed through the black market, and eventually landed in the hands of scholars who recognized what they were holding. It took decades to authenticate and translate, but in 2006, the Gospel of Judas was finally published, and it told a story that inverted everything Christianity had taught about its greatest villain. In this text, Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples. He tells Judas that he will be hated, that his name will be cursed by all future generations. But this isn't punishment, it's a sacred mission. Jesus explains that someone must betray him so that prophecy can be fulfilled, so that he can be crucified and resurrected, so that salvation can be achieved. And only Judas has the spiritual strength to bear this burden. The text contains a haunting line. Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Not the body, but the man, the earthly form that contains divine essence. Judas isn't betraying Jesus. He's helping Jesus shed his human shell and ascend to his true nature. The betrayal is an act of love, a necessary sacrifice that Judas must carry out, knowing he'll be remembered as evil incarnate. This changes everything. If Judas acted on Jesus' instructions, then he wasn't weak or greedy. He was the most faithful disciple, the only one trusted with the hardest task. The other disciples misunderstood. They saw betrayal where there was obedience. They hated Judas for doing exactly what Jesus needed him to do. The theological implications are staggering. If this version is true, then Christianity's entire moral framework, the narrative of free will, sin, redemption, and betrayal, collapses into something far more complex and unsettling. It suggests that what we call evil might sometimes be part of a divine plan. It suggests that the person everyone hates might be the person everyone should honor. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Irenaeus condemned this gospel in 180 AD, which means he read it, which means copies were circulating in Christian communities, which means the church knew this alternative narrative existed. And when scholars examined Vatican records after the 2006 publication, they found references suggesting the church possessed fragments, or possibly complete copies of this text for centuries. They never mentioned it. They let the world believe Judas was simply a traitor, nothing more. They built 2,000 years of theology on the foundation of his villainy. And all along, they had a text that told a different story. If they hid this gospel for so long, what else are they hiding? What other figures in Christian history have been misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented? What other texts sit in those 53 miles of shelving, waiting to overturn everything we think we know about the origins of faith? The Gospel of Judas was discovered by accident, found in Egyptian sand, rather than released by Vatican decree. How many more accidents need to happen before we understand the real story? For most of Christian history, Mary Magdalene has been portrayed as a reformed prostitute, a fallen woman saved by Jesus' forgiveness. That story is so embedded in popular consciousness that it feels like biblical truth, but it's not. The idea that Mary was a prostitute was invented by Pope Gregory I in 591 AD, 6 centuries after Jesus' death, as part of a deliberate effort to diminish her significance. The Bible never calls her a prostitute. That was church propaganda, designed to explain away why a woman held such prominence in the earliest Christian communities. Because Mary Magdalene was important, extremely important. The canonical Gospels, the ones that made it into the official Bible, can't erase her completely. She's there at the crucifixion when most male disciples fled, She's the first person to witness the resurrection. Jesus appears to her before he appears to Peter or any of the others. Even the approved texts can't hide that she was central to Jesus' ministry. But there's a gospel that goes further, much further. The Gospel of Mary was discovered in 1896 in Egypt, purchased by a German scholar from an antiquities dealer. It's fragmentary. Large sections are missing. But what remains is extraordinary. The text describes the period after Jesus' resurrection, when the disciples are gathering and trying to understand what they've witnessed. Mary speaks up. She tells them about a vision she received from Jesus, a private revelation containing teachings he never shared with the others. Peter's reaction is immediate and hostile. He asks, in essence, why would the Savior speak to a woman about things he never mentioned to us? Why would he give her knowledge he withheld from his male disciples? Andrew joins him in skepticism, suggesting Mary is making it up. But another disciple, Levi, defends her. He says something the church has spent 2,000 years trying to bury. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Loved her more than us. Not equally, more. The theological implication is explosive. This text suggests that Mary Magdalene wasn't just a follower. She was the primary disciple, the one closest to Jesus, the one who understood his teachings at a level the male disciples couldn't reach. It positions her as a spiritual authority, a teacher who should have led the early church. Instead, the church buried her. They turned her into a prostitute in sermons and art. They removed her from positions of spiritual leadership. They created a doctrine that restricts priesthood and religious authority exclusively to men, claiming it reflects the nature of Jesus' ministry. But if this gospel is accurate, that doctrine is built on erasure. It's built on the deliberate suppression of evidence that women held equal or superior spiritual authority in the earliest days of Christianity. And Mary isn't the only one. There are references in early Christian writings to other female apostles, other women who taught and led communities. The Acts of Paul and Thecla describes a woman who baptized converts. The Gospel of Philip suggests Mary Magdalene was Jesus' partner in a sacred, mystical sense. These texts were condemned, hidden, or destroyed. The question becomes unavoidable. Did the church deliberately erase female spiritual leadership? Did they suppress texts that showed women as teachers, prophets, and equals because those texts threatened a patriarchal power structure? How different would Christianity look today if the Gospel of Mary had been included in the Bible? How different would the world look if 2,000 years of religious doctrine hadn't been built on the systematic silencing of women's voices? These texts exist. Some are in museums now, studied by scholars. But how many more remain in Vatican storage? Still hidden, still suppressed, still waiting for the day when the church decides humanity is ready to know that the story they've been telling was never the whole truth.